Schuman's just started to speak. Oh Lord, off we go.
Le Parlement européen est ridicule, très ridicule. The Parliament is totally ridiculous.
La prego, signor Presidente, c'est pas la Commission qui doit contrôler le Parlement, c'est le Parlement qui doit contrôler la Commission.
You are ridiculous.
Nous ne sommes pas ridicules.
We are extremely united, more than ever.
We are more united than ever.
Don't try to drive a wedge. We are more united than ever, together with our transatlantic partners.
The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin.
What happened to some of the Cold War's winners?
That's enough. Put down the mic.
Europe is a garden. Everything works. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. The gardeners should take care of it.
We are on the right track to build the Europe of defense.
We are in an era of rearmament, ramping up ammunition production.
Shortages of natural gas supplies have sent prices soaring in Europe.
The biggest sustained increase in defense spending since the end of the Cold War.
The European Union will finance the delivery of weapons.
Money that is drenched in blood.
The US military presence in Europe helps the United States project power to the Middle East.
A wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. Of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway.
Targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity, and heating. These are acts of pure terror. Israel has the right to defend itself.
We can never let the crimes Russia's committing become our new normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal.
The United States has Israel's back. We have the back of the Israeli people. We have their back today. We'll have it tomorrow. We will have it every day.
Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Yes. I think it's unwise for politicians to sit in television studios and pronounce which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law.
It's hard to look at what he's doing and think that any moral individual could justify that. Sorry. It's difficult to look at some of the images.
It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt. I wish I could tell you something different.
Gaza has an underground tunnel city, and in order to get to this underground tunnel city, those areas must be destroyed. Every school, every mosque, every second house.
That's an argument for destroying the whole of Gaza, every single building in it.
So do you have another solution?
We stand with Israel.
Israel hat das Recht, sich zu verteidigen.
Western leaders, they all support Israel's right for self-defense.
This is not a time for whataboutism. This is terror in its worst form.
Hello. Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili, and I'm your host for tonight. It's great to be here in Brussels with you all. We're here because something in Europe, as you've seen from the video, is broken in ways that are making life poorer, harder, more uncertain, and more dangerous for millions of people. Let me give you a quick tour of some of what's broken with Europe. Of course, I have to start with Europe's role in what happened in Gaza. It may be out of the headlines now, but we haven't forgotten. Europe armed, funded, and shielded Israel as it carried out a genocide. Nearly 50,000 people were killed, mostly women and children, though the actual number is probably much higher. And you've all seen the videos. The destruction of Gaza is beyond words. The UN says that clearing the rubble will take at least 15 years. And yes, the ceasefire is holding for now, but if the bombs start dropping again, we already know where Europe will stand, right behind Israel, just like before. But what's broken in Europe goes way beyond its role in the Gaza genocide. Let's look closer to home, where European countries are pouring billions of euros into Ukraine, promising to fund its war with Russia for as long as it takes, while refusing to push for peace and flirting with World War III, I should say, to be precise. And I should add also that opposing endless war doesn't mean siding with Putin or Russia. Just as standing against genocide doesn't mean supporting Hamas. It has to be said. So back to Europe, and it gets worse. Europe, as we've seen over the last few days, all these meetings that are happening right here, this frenzy of political activity, is openly militarizing. Its leaders are calling for a war economy. We're back to coalitions of the willing and boots on the ground. The EU, a peace project, is now aiming to mobilize up to 800 billion euros for weapons, tanks, and defense, without real debate, without real consent. But at the same time, everything else is getting cut. Schools, hospitals, environmental protection, it's all too expensive to invest in. Europe's economy is stagnating, and life is becoming really, really tough. Wages are flat. Industries are collapsing. Whole regions are falling into decay. 40 million of our fellow Europeans can't afford to heat their homes. Younger generations here will be poorer than their parents for the first time in modern history. And meanwhile, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, admittedly at enormous social and environmental cost. But Europe is moving in the opposite direction. I can go on. Inequality is growing. The richest 10% of Europeans own 2/3 of the continent's wealth. European cities are being hollowed out by corporate landlords and Airbnb, while home ownership has become a fantasy for millions. And through all of this, Europe just follows Washington's lead on trade, on war, on military spending. It pretends to be independent, but it has no vision of its own. And now that the US has shifted its focus elsewhere, Europe feels more impotent, more irrelevant than ever. And what does an impotent and irrelevant establishment do? It cracks down on dissent. Say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free in public in some parts of Europe, and you can be arrested, fined, or even imprisoned. Call Gaza a genocide, and you could lose your job, as you'll hear tonight from one of our speakers, because that's exactly what happened to her. And how could we fail to notice that the EU, under the pretext of protecting us from hate speech and disinformation, is expanding its powers over what we can and cannot say? And lastly, perhaps even more worryingly, if elections in Europe produce the wrong outcome, they can now be cancelled, as we saw in Romania a few months ago. So all this is why we're here tonight. This Europe, we believe, is failing its people, betraying its history, and silencing those who call it out. This Europe is broken. The good news is that there's a radical energy in the air. Something has shifted. More than ever, huge numbers of people are fed up with the way things are, and they want to fight back. The bad news is that the only force effectively mobilizing this anger is the hard right. They're winning. In Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Sweden, Austria, and Germany, hard right parties are either in power or they're setting the agenda. They exploit people's justified rage over poverty, insecurity, corruption, and they place the blame on immigration. They take real problems and turn them into a false war between people who should be fighting side by side. They make Europe more hostile, more divided, more cruel. But I have to give it to them. They have a plan, as disturbing as it is, and they're executing it brilliantly. So tonight, we're asking, what's our plan? What happened to Europe? How did we get here? Where have we failed? What can we do differently to achieve a different result? So to attempt to answer these questions, I'll tell you how this evening is going to look. We're going to hear shortly from our four speakers in turn to dissect these issues from their respective standpoints. Then we'll bring them together for a panel discussion where we'll try to look not just at the problems, but also what we can do. Then we'll open the floor to you for a Q&A. We'll have a quick round of closing statements, and then we'll head upstairs to the bar to spark connections and hopefully plan the fight back together. Because the point of this event is not just to give you ideas, it's to equip you with connections, with allies, with a mission, whatever that mission might be, or at least the start of one. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage: Yanis Varoufakis, Katie Halper, Grace Blakeley, and Melanie Schweizer. And let me start off by giving the floor to Yanis. He probably needs no introduction. He's an economist, an ex-finance minister of Greece, author of several books, including Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism, co-founder of DiEM25, and my friend and colleague. The floor is yours.
Friends, fellow travelers, comrades, good evening Brussels. We once had a dream. It was a dream of what Europe could have been. A Europe of shared prosperity, of dignity, of freedom, a Europe of peace with hope. Alas, that dream is now dead. It's gone, it's lost, it's kaput, it's finished. Why? What the hell happened to Europe? Well, we know what happened to Europe. We know why politicians from all over are descending upon this splendid city as we speak, like manic drones determined to blow up, to bomb to smithereens what is left of the dream of Europe. We know what happened in Europe because we foretold it. On the 9th of February 2016, some of you might have been there, we were at the Volksbühne Theater in Berlin. And that was the day, the night, when DiEM25 was born. And in that meeting, we said, in no uncertain terms, Europe will either democratize or it will disintegrate. In the last 9 years, Europe refused to democratize, and therefore today it is disintegrating. It is degenerating into a totalitarian war union. You can see that, you can smell it. Friends, fellow travelers, comrades, this is what happens. This is what happens when you have austerity for the many and money printing as if there's no tomorrow for the very few. Mixed with this austerity, you have mind-numbing surges of inequality. Every time capitalism stagnates and inequality surges, while the official left joins the center in a futile attempt to bail out the bankrupt liberal establishment, do you know what is around the corner every time that happens? Fascism and war. Just like in the 1930s, two varieties of totalitarianism began to tussle for power. On the one hand, on the one side, the radicalized neo-fascist right promises to make us great again, not through ending austerity or exploitation, but through a moral reckoning, a kind of cultural cleansing that targets the impure foreign bodies in the pure body of the nation, or at least the Christian, white, patriarchal Europe. Foreigners, trans people, lesbians, Muslims, and Jews, particularly those who don't support genocide, are proclaimed the enemy within. On the other side, you have the radicalized totalitarian centrists who succeeded in retaining their relevance as the only bulwark against the fascists. How do they do that? With policies that deepen the crisis that fuels fascism. And thus their own claim to be the only bulwark against fascism. This is the definition of a perfect vicious cycle that fuels totalitarianism. Like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the radicalized totalitarian centrists and the radicalized neo-fascists, they are sucking the air out of democracy, making totalitarianism great again. Every variety of it. Lest we forget, we did not have to wait for fascists to win government before our Greek referendum of July 2015 was banned because they didn't like the outcome. We didn't have to wait for the fascists to win government before they fired Melanie Schweizer from her job at the German civil service for failing to support genocide. We didn't have to wait for the fascists to win government before they banned me from entering Germany, even via Zoom. We didn't have to wait for the fascists to win government before the Romanian presidential elections were cancelled simply because the radicalized totalitarian centrists didn't like the outcome. The only substantive difference between the 1930s and our times today, do you know what it is? The only difference is that Tweedledum, that is the radicalized totalitarian centrists, and Tweedledee, the radicalized neo-fascist parties, they have traded places when it comes to war. Somehow, confusingly, Tweedledum, the radicalized totalitarian centrists, who are weaponizing military Keynesianism, are crying out for more war, for an endless war. And the Tweedledee part of the equation, the radicalized neo-fascists, they are advocating for peace. Well, a very steely, very ruthless, very chilling form of peace. So, yes, in 2015, 2016, we foretold all that at the Volksbühne Theater. But that didn't stop us from failing to stop it. A cruel reminder that being right is not everything. Why did we fail? Why did we miss the popular wave, which 10 years ago was on our side of politics? And why, therefore, did we allow the fascists to exploit their revived thirst for radicalism? Yes, it is true. We were ruthlessly squeezed between Tweedledum, the radicalized totalitarian centrists, and Tweedledee, the radicalized neo-fascist right. But we have to confess that we made some unforced errors ourselves. We invested, and this is a personal criticism too much on green Keynesianism, forgetting the timeless lesson that even when the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, adopts Keynesianism as a last resort to save themselves, the ruling class will always stop it, withdraw from it the moment their bottom line improves, well before the many taste any of the fruits of Keynesianism, green or not so green. Our Green New Deal was, after all, never adopted, except in name. They even dropped the new. They just made it a Green Deal. Totally vacuous program, which now, of course, is dead in the water. So our Green New Deal contributed in the mind of people out there who are not particularly political. Every time they hear the word green, they immediately think, you know what they translate it to? It's like the Iraqis in Baghdad, when they hear the word democracy with an American accent, they hide under the table because they know they will be bombed. The people of Europe, the strugglers of Europe, when they hear the word green policy, they think, oh my God, they will tax me again. Higher cost of living for me that had to shoulder the banking crisis, the bailouts. We also proved unable to liberate people from exploitation. What we gave them as the M25 was the freedom to choose their pronouns on our website, which would have been fine if it wasn't so pathetically inadequate in the grander scheme of things. Therefore, we ended up, instead of organizing auto workers, the precariat, nurses, we organized signifiers, appearing, let's admit to that, appearing to many people, to the vast majority, as an intellectual vanguard that is really enjoying the self-styled subversive thrills from an imagined revolution with all the comforts and trappings of a bourgeois soirée. And last but not least, we thought, and that's DiEM25, we thought we could mobilize and radicalize the existing left, center-left, green parties, only to discover 2 or 3 years later that they didn't care. They were not interested. And now, what must we do now? Let's begin by acknowledging that we are at the end of a 40-year-long cycle of a vicious class war waged against working people. And we're at the beginning of another cycle, this time of military Keynesianism, of weaponized xenophobia, of totalitarianism within, and techno-feudalism all around us. So, it's time to be bold, time to be clear on 7 crucial issues that must become 7 crucial campaigns. On security and peace, or peace with security. And how to end the carnage on the killing fields of Ukraine, where lives are being devoured by a ruthless mechanical precision. Let us reject outright Donald Trump's predatory seizure of Ukraine's natural resources. Let us campaign to get the whole of Europe, not just one country or another, out of NATO immediately. There is no point in NATO. It has been proven. Donald Trump has proven it. We should have proven it before Donald Trump. But we need to get out of NATO. Brussels needs to throw NATO into the sea. Let us plot a course to a non-aligned but never neutral Europe. A non-aligned but never neutral Europe. Offering to relax sanctions as a carrot and return to Russia its $300 billion of frozen assets. We should immediately commence negotiations with the Kremlin and with Beijing on a comprehensive strategic arrangement between Europe, Russia, and China, an arrangement within which Ukraine becomes, in the next 100 years, what Austria was during the Cold War. What was Austria during the Cold War? It was sovereign, it was neutral, democratic, and as integrated with the rest of Europe as its citizens needed and desired. That's what the plan for Ukraine should be. On green prosperity, we must fiercely oppose military Keynesianism. It is unsustainable. The only thing it can produce is poverty, debt, and more crisis, not to mention war. We must fiercely oppose military Keynesianism, and we must replace it with a massive green investment program that combines development with degrowth. On dignity, let us campaign for a new monetary commons that sidelines private banks, offers a trust fund for everyone, and guarantees a universal dividend, call it a universal basic income, to each. On the big thorny issue of migration, let us turn the accusation of us being soft on foreigners into a virtue. Let us shout it from the rooftops that Europe without mass migration will die, it will perish, it will not be viable. Let us proclaim that we want migrants, not out of solidarity, but out of self-interest. On combating techno-feudalism, let us sanction immediately the cloudless tech lords, not just Musk, but Jeff Bezos, Peter Thiel, Google. Let's restrict immediately the access to the European markets of Amazon, of Uber, of Airbnb. Instead of the Luxembourg, Ireland, Holland means by which they pay no tax, let us tax them to extinction. Let's impose... Can't we create our own apps in this continent of ours? Why do we need them? Let us impose interoperability. That would really cut them off at the knees. Let's end the ban on companies like the Dutch company ASML to export tech to China. And above all else, let us develop our own socialized cloud capital, the stirrings of a magnificent future techno-socialism. On freedom. Shall we dismantle totalitarianism now in each one of our countries? Shall we not benefit enormously from fighting for everyone's freedom to vote and for their vote to be counted? For the freedom of expression of our enemies as well, not just the people we agree with. Unlike J.D. Vance, who rightly spoke out in Munich, if you remember, a few weeks ago, against Europe's descent into censoriousness. He did say that. He was right. Except, of course, that he was a bloody hypocrite, because he would never defend Julian Assange's right to journalism or our right to freedom of speech in favor of Palestine. Speaking of Palestine and free speech, it is clear now, is it not, that what started in Gaza cannot stay in Gaza. Such brutality could not be contained within Gaza. To keep it from our media, from our cultural institutions, from the streets and the squares where we demonstrate, the powers that be had to dissolve basic civil liberties in Germany, in Holland, in France, in the United States. That's why our seventh campaign must be stop genocide, get the whole of Europe to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, the last apartheid state, in the same way that we sanctioned, divested, and boycotted South Africa under apartheid. Friends, fellow travelers, comrades, we have much to do. The European dream is dead. Long live the dream that we are dreaming tonight together. Carpe diem. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. Okay, our next speaker is the American journalist and political commentator Katie Halper. She's currently making a documentary about Holocaust survivors who are speaking out against the genocide. She's the host of the Katie Halper Show. Welcome, Katie. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you. That was great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. So the organizers were really adamant that tonight not just be depressing, but be inspiring and give people hope. Oh, I'm glad you're already laughing. Okay. So I know it's funny, right, to think of something on this topic being inspiring. But in that vein, I want to start off tonight with actually a game. Okay, so this game is called Who Said It? Donald Trump or Noam Chomsky? Okay, so let's see how everyone does. Ready? Okay. Who said the following? Ready? And in some cases, I'm not going to quote verbatim, because if I quote verbatim, it's too obvious from the style of talking. So it'll either be a quote or it'll be a summary of what they said, okay? So who said the U.S. won't sanction Saudi Arabia over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi because that would jeopardize billions in arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Raise your hand if you think it's Trump. Okay, Chomsky? All right, it was Trump. And not only was it Trump, but he was saying it about himself. He was explaining why he wouldn't sanction Khashoggi. Okay, let's see what's next. We left troops behind in Syria for the oil. Okay, who says Trump? Okay, Chomsky? Trump. Okay, good one. All right. Who said in response to claims of Russian interference in U.S. presidential elections, who said in response to that, the U.S. has interfered in the elections of many other nations? Chomsky? Trump. Chomsky. Okay, who said the Iraq War sunk America's prestige? Chomsky? Trump. Chomsky. Who said there are a lot of killers? What do you think? Our country's so innocent? Trump? Chomsky? Trump. That was Trump. Okay. And who responded to the claim that the only one who wants the war to continue is Hamas? Who responded to that claim by saying, actually, Israel is the one who wants the war to continue? Trump, okay. Chomsky? Trump, okay. So the reason that we can even play this game of who said it, Donald Trump or Chomsky, is because they do have something in common. They state inconvenient truths. And there are a few differences, obviously, starting with the fact that when he's not stating inconvenient truths, Donald Trump is lying pathologically and rather creatively and flagrantly. Also, they have a totally different value system, right? So let's go back to one of the earlier quotes I did about how Israel wants the war to go on. That was actually taken during the one and only debate of 2024 between Trump and Biden. Biden said the only one who wants the war to continue is Hamas, and Trump said, actually, Israel is the one. But he finished that sentence. The full sentence was, actually, Israel is the one, and you should let them finish the job. So there he has it. He's critical of Israel in a weird way, or maybe he's praising Israel according to his moral values. Obviously, Chomsky would have shared that same observation about Israel wanting the war to go on, but would use that to then argue why Israel should not be funded by the United States, right? Okay. But he also, by the way, I should bring up one other thing that Trump said that really resonated during the debate, which was at the end, Joe Biden said something, and Trump said, I really don't know what he said. I don't think he knows either. So at that moment, we were all Trump. Okay. But back to the Trump-Chomsky game. I don't bring it up to taint Chomsky as Trumpian. It's not to praise Trump as Chomskyan. It's not to make some lazy horseshoe theory-based observation about how the left and right meet each other. And it's not to argue that Trump isn't an imperialist or that Chomsky is. And also, I'm not an accelerationist. I'm not arguing that it's a good thing Trump was elected. I don't believe it won't get better until it gets worse. I'm saying that a silver lining of Trump's presidency is that he's laying bare the brutality of American imperialism, a brutality the Democrats tried to conceal. And so we should take advantage of that. Now, as disgusting as it is, okay, thank you. As disgusting as it is for Trump to announce plans to open a Riviera on the Gaza Strip, isn't it nice to hear someone admit that our foreign policy, when I say our, I'm talking as American, our foreign policy isn't driven by a commitment to fairness, justice, and the rules-based order? Isn't it helpful to know that there is, in fact, no rules-based order? Isn't it helpful to not pretend that the US funds and enables Israel because it's a democracy? Another example is Ukraine. So people are scandalized that Trump spoke to Zelensky like a petulant, ungrateful, uncooperative, and self-sabotaging child, which he did. But isn't that in some ways preferable to what Biden did? Biden may have said nice things about Zelensky, but what did he actually do? He dangled NATO membership in front of him, while knowing full well that was never a possibility. He claimed to care about Ukrainian sovereignty and self-determination, while sending Boris Johnson to tell Zelensky not to negotiate with Putin 1 month into the war. Had they done that, the war would be over by now, thousands of people would be alive, and Ukraine would, of course, have more land than they will ever have now. It's also worth noting, by the way, that 52% of Ukrainians want negotiated settlement. So when people say listen to Ukrainians, you should find out which Ukrainians they're talking about. Trump speaks crudely and cruelly of natural minerals in Ukraine, but if the US is going to exploit Ukraine, isn't it better that Americans know what the war is really about? And isn't it better for Ukrainians to know what the US is really prioritizing? And now, another thing I want to thank Trump for is bringing Elon Musk into the forefront. because like Trump, he's exposing things, right? So first of all, this guy literally comes out with a chainsaw to demonstrate how he wants to cut the welfare state, which again, that would be like a parody. Like that's something the left would say about him to criticize him, but he actually does it. That's how out of touch he is. Also, it was great when he gave the Nazi salute, not because I'm a fan of the Nazi salute, but because it was so great at exposing the absolute bankrupt hypocrisy and rank hypocrisy of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which claims to combat anti-Semitism, but really creates anti-Semitism by suggesting that they're not clapping for anti-Semitism, they're clapping for calling it out by suggesting that being Jewish and being Zionist are the same thing. I mean, maybe it's like a bad sign when your talking points are shared by the KKK. Because think about the people who use the term Zionist and Jewish interchangeably, right? It's like David Duke types, real neo-Nazis, and then, of course, the ADL and AIPAC and Israel. Okay, politics makes strange bedfellows. Anyway, so when Elon Musk gave that salute, what was so great about it was that the ADL had to defend him. The ADL said that it wasn't actually that problematic. People were on edge. People need to calm down. People were being too sensitive. But it was totally kosher. My word, not theirs at the end. But basically, I paraphrased. So that was useful because it laid bare what despicable people the ADL are. Now, I also liked it because it brought out Steve Bannon. And he did another salute. But the reason I like Steve Bannon is because he makes me feel really special. Because he said that the number one enemy are Jews who are critical of Israel, American Jews who are critical of Israel. So I was kind of blushing. Yeah. Yeah. How much time? When did I start? I forgot to check the starting time. Sorry about this. All right. So the other good thing about this is that people are seeing through the Dems. They're waking up to the fact that the Democrats did not fight against Trump. They don't really want to fight against Trump in the way he needs to be fought against. They are feckless. They care more about defeating someone like Bernie Sanders than defeating someone like Donald Trump. And, you know, people are waking up to that. The numbers, like Democrat voters have very low opinions right now of Democrats in Congress. Now, to be fair, I have to mention these people. There are some people who are truly awful, who continue to blame third-party voters for giving us Trump, taunt Palestinian Americans for staying home or voting third party. They refer to them as Dearborn voters. They tell us that people are self-indulgent practitioners of purity politics who needed to do whatever it took to stop Trump. Well, if people needed to do whatever was needed to defeat Trump, shouldn't that have included Kamala Harris? Because for a year and a half, a significant and vocal portion of the Democratic Party electorate and their progressive base organized, begged, and demonstrated for the party to change its policy of blanket diplomatic support for Israel and curtail extraordinary lengths to arm an active genocide in Gaza. The polls showed this would have helped her numbers. Was it not self-indulgent and Trump enabling of her to ignore the base and instead run around with Liz Cheney and brag about getting an endorsement from war criminal Dick Cheney? And by the way, a YouGov IMEU poll showed that 29% of voters nationally who voted for Biden in 2020 and cast a ballot for someone besides Kamala Harris in 2024 did that because ending Israel's violence in Gaza was the top issue affecting their vote choice. So again, Kamala Harris should have been listening to her base. Remember, the person running is supposed to earn the votes, right? It's not the other way around. Okay, sorry, I need some water. Sorry about that. Thank you, sorry. I'll just take it in there, thank you. Sorry, everyone. All right. Okay. Sorry I'm reading so much, by the way. Okay. Now, another thing that's positive is that people are seeing through the media. So more than 75,000 subscribers have canceled their Washington Post subscriptions since Jeff Bezos announced he would only promote free market and libertarian ideals. Another example, thank you for saying the quiet part out loud, Jeff. Again, that's like a critique that you would make of him, Yanis, but he's saying it about himself. Also, MSNBC viewership is really low. And, you know, I do want to say how disgusting Western media has been on Gaza. I actually learned this kind of firsthand. I mean, my experience was not that bad, and it certainly pales in comparison to Melanie's, which you'll hear about shortly. But I made a video at an outlet called The Hill. I wrote a monologue saying that Israel was an apartheid state, and for that I got fired. And even though there was really nothing you can say, because the video pointed out how many people, including the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, and including like former Israeli prime ministers, were calling it apartheid state. But people are seeing through the media because the media is just an arm of the state, not only of the United States, but of Israel. And one of the most, I think, disgusting examples of this was the way that rape was reported on. So the Western media was totally complicit in this narrative of a mass rape, coordinated mass rape, systemic mass rape committed by Hamas, they claimed. All of the witnesses walked it back. All of the witnesses were debunked. No one was saying, this wasn't an issue of believe women, because no one was saying it happened to them. Now, this same media who covered that story and never retracted it decided to ignore the fact that it was documented that Palestinians were raped. I mean, this was covered by Israeli media, and somehow Western media never covered it. This isn't like, you don't even have to go to Haaretz. This was centrist and right-wing media that covered this. This was sexual assault captured on video. And this is something that you actually had a member of the Knesset. They were debating whether or not to arrest people who had raped Palestinian prisoners. The debate wasn't about, that's what the debate was about. There were protests when they started to arrest soldiers, but the protests weren't about the rapes. The protests were about arresting them. And you actually had a member of the Knesset being asked rhetorically, so is it legitimate to insert sticks into people's rectums? And a member of the Knesset said, yes, it's legitimate. Why wasn't that story all over Western media? Why don't the people who claim to care about rape and sexual violence talking about that? So you have to remember this, that the media is totally untrustworthy when it comes to this issue especially, and they don't care about Palestinian lives. But, you know, luckily, it's becoming harder and harder to paint the pro-Palestine movement as anti-Semitic. It's becoming harder and harder to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And again, I'd like to remind people that to suggest that conflation is anti-Semitic, and it's the old dual loyalty trope, which is that all Jews are a monolith and we're all loyal to Israel. I think it's undermined by the fact that you have people like so many Jews protesting the war in Gaza, but it's also undermined when you see the state, which claims to care about Jewish safety, do things like arrest Jewish students who are protesting. That's something that unites the whole Western world, right? So you see that happening in the United States. You see that happening in Germany with Yanis, but also where you had Udi Az, who was wearing a yarmulke and got thrown down the stairs by German police. You see that when you have literal Holocaust survivors like Stephen Kaposh, who's being questioned by the police for protesting for Palestinian rights. You see that in London when you have someone like Chaim Brashith, who's the son of Holocaust survivors, an Israeli, arrested for saying that Israel was not going to be able to defeat Hamas. So all of these things are being laid bare. And I want to just end off by quoting someone, because the real inspiration comes from so many different struggles that are so interconnected. But I know a lot of people are like, oh, what can give us hope, or how do we keep going? And I feel like hope actually is a discipline and a choice. And we owe it to the world to keep it. I understand losing hope, but we have to keep reinventing it. And people here probably know who Rafat al-Arir is. He was a poet and professor in Gaza. Yeah. He wrote a beautiful poem called If I Must Die, and he was murdered by Israel. He was targeted. This was not a random, it wasn't just a random war crime, it was a targeted one. His sister's apartment building was struck, but it was just the sister's apartment because they knew he was there. So they didn't take out the whole building, they just took that one out because they wanted to kill him. And they wanted to kill him because this poet spoke out against Israel's genocide. And he and I were corresponding a couple of months before he was killed. And I asked him, what can we do? What can we do in the West? And he said, thank you for offering more pressure on the media, more coverage, more Palestinian voices, more protests. Hopefully Israel is curbed ASAP. And so that is the message that I want to leave you with. More pressure on the media, more coverage, more Palestinian voices, more protests. And hopefully Israel is curbed ASAP. And no matter what happens, we have to keep doing those things. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for that. Brilliant. Our next speaker is Grace Blakeley. She's an economics and political commentator from the UK and an author most recently of Vulture Capitalism. Grace, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you tonight. And it's great to hear that the war economy is back, because that means neoliberalism is over, right? We're going to get a big state back. We're going to get military Keynesianism, and we like Keynesianism, don't we? Because that's social democracy. This is all very exciting. It's literally the end of neoliberalism. I mean, that's obviously not what I really think, right? My most recent book, Vulture Capitalism, dismantles this claim, this idea that capitalism is a free market system, that the state and the market are two separate spheres of power, and that, you know, when you get more state, that means less market and vice versa. And looks at the neoliberal movement and its claims that they were coming in to deliver on a promise of human freedom, to free up markets, shrink the state, allow you all as individuals to achieve, you know, the heights of what you could possibly think, because all of the horrible bureaucratic stuff would just get out of the way and the market would allow you to rise to the top. We really need to stop believing what these guys tell us about what they want to do, because we know that they speak in kind of double speak. Neoliberalism was never about shrinking the state or freeing the market. Neoliberalism was about crushing opposition, restoring order and hierarchy, and augmenting the power of the ruling class over everyone else. It emerged in a very particular moment. It emerged in a moment of disorder, of ungovernability. We had societies all over the rich world, all over Europe, that were rocked by industrial disputes, powerful labor movements shutting down the whole economy, peace movements, environmentalists standing up to authority and saying, you don't get to tell us what to do. We don't accept your authority. We don't accept your legitimacy. Neoliberalism was about restoring the discipline, the order, and the authority of the ruling classes over the rest of society. It was about reminding everyone else who was in charge. That's why our governments broke up protest movements. It's why in my country, the UK, Margaret Thatcher used the ruthless power of the British state to crush the labour movement, sending unemployment through the roof, literally sending police to beat striking miners. Do you think that stopped because we've got the war economy and military Keynesianism? Do we feel like we live in a world where, you know, we have this dream of freedom and, you know, individual effort and a state that is stepping back and allowing us to do our own thing? No, of course not. The war economy goes hand in hand with the extended and expanded crushing of the opposition, with the deepening of the control of the ruling class over every area of life. If you don't believe me, go and ask people living in Russia. When there was a columnist the other day in the UK who wrote in the Financial Times, if Europe wants to build out the warfare economy, it's going to have to shrink the welfare economy. You know who did that really well? Vladimir Putin. You know what else he had to do to crush dissent that would come out when poor people start to see their pensions cut, their teachers' salaries cut? He didn't cut the salaries of the people who exist to crush that form of protest. That is the route that that Europe is potentially going down. The problem was never that the state was too small or too big. The problem wasn't an imbalance between the state and the market. The problem was and is an imbalance of power between people and elites or as the old school Marxist in me would say, between labor and capital. The war economy is a great example of how capitalism really works. It's based on deep cooperation between the public and private sector in pursuit of augmenting the power, the imperial power of particular governments, and obviously the wealth and power of individual capitalists. One example that I talk about in my book, and a company that's going to benefit from the expansion of the war economy, is Boeing. Some of you may remember a few years ago the 737 MAX disasters when 2 Boeing planes nosedived out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people. You might remember recently that Boeing whistleblowers have been in the news because they've been in court testifying against the company, and many of them have died. You might have seen that a door blew out of a Boeing plane mid-flight. All of this stuff was basically shoddy engineering that came about during the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, corporate greed, crush the unions, ignore the engineers, insert layers and layers of middle management, and focus on this one goal of maximizing value for shareholders. Fair enough, that just sounds like classic free market capitalism, right? That's just a bad corporation. And if we just had competent governments that could regulate them better, then everything would have been fine. But that's not quite right with Boeing. Because Boeing was, in the years of the 737 MAX disasters, the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. That means it got money from the government in the form of tax breaks and subsidies. It also was an integral part of the military-industrial complex. It had tons of government contracts. And the regulator that was supposed to be regulating this company, the FAA, it was run according to a logic of self-regulation. You might be familiar with that because it's the same philosophy that underpinned how the banks were regulated before the financial crisis of 2008. In the run-up to these disasters, Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the FAA that sat inside Boeing and whose workers were being paid by Boeing. That's self-regulation for you. The relationship between Boeing and the American state was and is extremely close. There's a revolving door between the upper echelons of the Boeing Corporation and the upper echelons of the American state. It's not the case that greater regulation or a more effective separation between state and market would have dealt with this issue. This is how capitalism works. It's not a free market system. It's based on the existence of massive multinational corporations that are effectively monopolies or oligopolies that have immense amounts of control over their markets, over their workers, over the planet, and are able to work with and influence governments to do what they want. This was very clear in the case of Boeing. Don't think Europe is excluded, by the way. Don't think this is just an American issue, because Airbus, Boeing's only real competitor, has been embroiled in all sorts of corruption scandals as well. And we know how powerful corporate lobbyists are in this very city. It's also something that we can see very clearly today, right? You know, I wrote this book, I started writing it 3 years ago, and as it's come out, like, Elon Musk is literally in the White House working with Donald Trump. Even I wouldn't have predicted that it would be so naked and so obvious. But what I did write about in the book is, I think, quite illuminating and shows that this isn't actually as novel as you might think. Because if you go back nearly 100 years, there is another Musk-like figure who was very close to the American state as well. His name was Henry Ford. He was also a Nazi sympathizer, named by Hitler in Mein Kampf as a good guy. He was, I think, the kind of archetypical capitalist in the sense that he wasn't really about free markets. He was about the assertion of order and discipline and control. He was an ardent anti-unionist, actually hired thugs to go and beat up striking workers, just as Elon Musk has been named as one of the world's worst union busters. He even enforced certain standards on his workers. He said, you can get $5 a day, but you're not allowed to drink, your wife isn't allowed to work outside the home. All of these measures, they had nothing to do with free markets or efficiency or productivity. They were about control. They were about power. That is what capitalism is about. That is what the craziness that we're seeing at the moment about the war economy is about. That is why our elites have worked so hard to shut down dissent over conflict, to crush Palestinians. Because the idea is we're in charge, and you'll take what you're given. You won't get it because you protest. Protest doesn't work. You won't get it because you organize. Unions don't work. You'll take what we give you. Concessions that are given by us to you because we're the good guys, right? That's what this system is. The war economy represents a complete and utter continuation of this model. And I think it speaks to some of the strategic failures of the left, as Yanis was just mentioning, that we've ended up in this kind of cul-de-sac of people saying, right, well, the German debt brake is gone. Great. Fantastic. This is what we've been campaigning for ages. This is the end of neoliberalism because governments are spending lots of money again. Governments have been spending lots of money for a very long time. They just haven't been spending money to support workers. They've been spending money, dishing out vast sums of money to capitalists. Go back to the 2008 financial crisis. Go back to the pandemic, right? When all of the countries in Europe ended up distributing tons of cash to their big companies. Those companies then went on to lay off workers, avoid taxes, dish out money to shareholders. This happened everywhere. This cooperation between governments and states is very much alive and well. This isn't a new theory of capitalism, by the way. Other than Yanis, I have another favorite Greek Marxist political economist. His name is Nikos Palantzas, and he wrote a very long time ago that the capitalist state was a social relation. What does that mean? He was making a comparison with the way that Marx talks about capital, that capital is a social relation. It's based on this particular relationship between workers and bosses, right? And in the same way, what happens within the state is based on the balance of power between society as a whole. So we aren't getting these terrible outcomes for working people because governments are just doing the wrong policies. We're getting these terrible outcomes for working people because working people aren't organized. Their interests aren't represented within the halls of power. And they're still not represented in the halls of power. So when governments announce we're going to do more spending and we're going to spend loads of money on the military, we can't suddenly think, great, that's going to mean the working class is suddenly going to get what they want. It's going to suddenly change this system that has caused so much pain and misery, stagnation for such a very, very long time. The war economy, by the way, is also a very inefficient way of doing Keynesianism. It's going to eat up a lot of resources that ultimately get destroyed or worn out, doesn't create as many jobs. Europe remains incredibly reliant on American military technology. A lot of it gets sucked abroad. You know what would be a really good alternative? How is Putin funding this war? By selling Europe and the rest of the world fossil fuels. Europe has actually sent more money to Russia in the form of fuel payments than it has given to Ukraine in aid since the beginning of this war. Why doesn't Europe consider decarbonization? That would reduce our reliance on autocrats all over the world who depend on fossil fuels. That would deal with one of the biggest and most significant threats, probably the most biggest and significant threat to us, which is climate breakdown, and would create 3 times as many jobs than any other form of stimulus program. Why not? Well, because doing so would not be in the interests of the European ruling elite and its friends within the arms industry. You know, when Keir Starmer says we're going to cut aid and boost defense spending, who's going to benefit that? BAE Systems. BAE Systems also has a very close relationship with the British state. It was at the center of what was called one of the largest and most corrupt arms deals in history between the UK and another massive fossil fuel producer, Saudi Arabia. This corruption is endemic to this industry, and it's part of why these calls for the war economy are happening so loudly now. I think it's very clear that most European politicians are not interested in the living standards of most people, in their jobs or their wages. That's not why we're calling, or not why we're hearing calls for the war economy today. They want their defense companies to be strong and powerful so they can beat other defense companies. Liberals really like to quote Orwell. I don't like doing it so much, but I think now is a good time when he said the war is not meant to be won. It's meant to be continuous. Vladimir Putin would probably agree with that, and I'm sure that a lot of our political leaders today are starting to reflect that logic. Another thing that Palantzas said when he talked about the capitalist state, he said it was a social relation, that most of the time what happens within the capitalist state reflects the balance of power within society. In a capitalist society, that tends to mean outcomes reflect the interests of capital. But the capitalist state, he said, is also used as a tool to divide and disperse workers. And that's a very, very important tool that is being used today. Most people in our societies, in our economies, most people don't actually think that this model is working, right? If you go and ask people almost anywhere, even in the rich world across Europe, do you think the economy works for you? they'll say no, right? People don't stick with this model because they think it's working. They stick with this model because they can't imagine an alternative. Why can't they imagine an alternative? Let's go back to when we had the birth of neoliberalism. Things weren't like this. People could imagine alternatives. They were out on the streets every day fighting for those alternatives. Fighting for alternatives when it came to the peace movement, fighting for alternatives when it came to the climate, fighting for alternatives in their workplace. You know, we had strong unions, but they weren't just fighting for higher wages. They were fighting for control over the production process. These were educated workers who say, we can run this company better than you. And actually, they proved that they could on a number of different occasions. What happened? Neoliberalism was a really effective project at convincing us that we are all alone, that we are isolated, that we are divided, that we are little mini capitalists, right? We have our houses, we have our pension pots, and if we just sit down and focus on the stock market and don't look at anything else that's going on around us, our lives will get better. And for a while it worked. Until 2008, that bargain held. But since then it has not held. And yet we still feel alone and disempowered. So in swoops the far right, with its promises about belonging, about community, you being part of something, part of a great nation, with this long history, this long trajectory, feeling strong again, feeling like you're part of something. The left hasn't been able to do that, in most cases. We've instead been going and talking at people, saying, if you vote for us, we'll protect you, we'll save you, we'll expand the size of the state, we'll undo neoliberalism, often using words that people have never even heard before. And that's why I think we are seeing the far right exploit this crisis so much more effectively than the left. Because often far right politicians are in communities telling people, you see that playground over there that hasn't had any investment in a very long time, that your kids can't use anymore? The reason that that's happened is because of migrants. Your rent's gone up. Why? Because of migrants. Where is the left? The left used to be there. Back in those moments when we were strong, when we were powerful, when we were effective, we were in communities. We were in workplaces. We were there talking to people and not just saying, vote for this political party and we'll give you nice things. Saying, right, well, you know, we actually organized a protest last week to save your community center and that's why your kids have somewhere to go after school. And if we can all work together to try and do that at the next election, then we can extend those gains. And in fact, not we can extend those gains, you can extend those gains. Because you are part of something that is very powerful. You are part of a class, part of a movement that spans history, part of a class that won restrictions on working time, that's fought battles against capitalists, against states all over the world, that's won socialized healthcare, that's won education, that has won so much. And yet over the last 50 years, you have been convinced that you are powerless, and you're not. That's what we need to be saying. So I'm obviously, as always, I have a policy background. I'm super enthusiastic about talking about policies, you know, how we can make a project for renewing a fair and sustainable economy effective, how we can push back against the war economy with a project of kind of genuine green democratic Keynesianism. But before we can do any of that, we need to deal with the fundamental issue, which is this imbalance of power within society and the conviction that is held by so many people that they are alone fighting against this profoundly unfair system. That kind of organizing is about rebuilding trust. It's about being there with people. And that probably sounds just like words, but here in this country, actually, there's a political party who I know and love very well, the PTB, who are doing a pretty good job of this. I went and interviewed some of their leaders, and they said, you know, they've got things like medicine for the people, where it's literally, they have doctors that go into workplaces that have serious occupational health hazards and say, we're going to help you, and also you should probably form a union because otherwise these things are going to carry on happening. They're in communities doing things like stopping community centers getting shut down. The parallel of this in Greece with the far right was Golden Dawn during austerity, when they were out there delivering medicines to people. You know, if the left does not do this, then the far right will. The good news is that we are doing it in lots of different places, because I think the spirit of the left, far from this sense of, wanting centralized power to be able to plan everything. No, the spirit of the left is anti-authoritarianism. It is about being established in a community, bringing people together and saying, we can fight back and build something better. And that is happening everywhere. If you just look in your communities, I can guarantee you there's something cool happening. Whether that's a community-owned energy company, whether it's a tenants union, whether it's a new labor union. This stuff is happening everywhere. And I really think that rather than just, as fun as it is to be here standing on stages and talking about what we are going to do for people, I think we as the left need to be out there bringing those movements together and telling people, showing people that they can change things, that they are part of this historic movement, and that they have power in a system that wants them to believe that they have none. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, very well said. And please join me in welcoming our last speaker, Melanie Schweizer. She's a lawyer, a former senior policy advisor and civil servant in Germany, until, of course, she lost her job for speaking out against the genocide. Melanie.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to this timely and so important event this evening. It's really an honor to be here tonight alongside such incredible voices in the fight for justice and democracy. I also want to say that I'm actually really nervous, of course, because for two things. So first, I'm new to this whole thing. I have used to be a civil servant working in the ministry behind a desk. Every now and then I did policy mainly, but sometimes I would write a little bit about a speech, but of course I would never be in front of a room talking to a lot of people and be with such incredible people on a stage. I rather prepared for it. I actually also do hold a degree, a bachelor's degree in political science, but I remember when we had the final degree event, our dean used to say the political scientist is to politics like the scientist of spiders to spiders. He actually doesn't want to have to do anything with it. And I can say it couldn't be more the truth. I actually really never wanted to do politics. I wanted to do law. I wanted to work with the Constitution. And then everything changed ever since definitely 7th of October. And it was a sheer necessity out of desperation to do something, because I woke up in Germany in a nightmare and in a never-ending, I like to call it, episode of Black Mirror, daily horror by German media and by German politicians. So